And as I just kept digging deeper and deeper, it just got like more interesting.
Yeah.
And there were no YouTube videos about it. Not really. Like there were maybe
Yeah.
a few. There were no YouTube videos about it. Like there was only just sort of these obscure interviews of the Wanses or of
Yeah.
Eddie Murphy or Tommy Davidson. And I was just like, someone needs to put this together. And no one else was doing it. So I said I would do it for myself.
My God.
Now look, check it. It's simple. It's simple. See this? This the kingpin, all right? And he the man. You get the other dude's king, you got the game. And he trying to get your king too, so you got protected.
So how do you get to be the king?
It ain't like that. See, the king, stay the king, all right? Everything stay who he is, except for the pawns. Now for pawn, made it all the way down to the other dude's side, you get to be queen. And like I said, the queen ain't no bitch.
All right, but if I make it to the end, I'm top dog.
Nah, yo, it ain't like that. Look, the pawns, man, in the game, they get capped quick. They be out the game early.
Unless they some smart-ass pawns.
The Wire is likely the most celebrated show in television history, even though it only won 16 of its 60 nominated awards, which contained 0 Emmy wins, and the bulk of its wins came during or after 2008, the year that the show went off the air. There are countless podcasts, articles, and books looking back at this show. The number of notable actors who spent time working on The Wire is gargantuan, and I can't name them all here, but they include Idris Elba, Michael K. Williams, Dominic West, Lance Reddick, Michael B. Jordan, Tristan Wilde, Sonia Son, Jamie Hector, Wood Harris, Wendell Pierce, Andre Royo, Method Man, Hassan Johnson, and Michael Hyatt. Oh, Franklin's mom was on The Wire? But before we can talk about The Wire, we have to talk about The Corner, its predecessor, which is also set in Baltimore. And before we can talk about The Corner, we have to talk about Homicide, a monumental police procedural set in Baltimore. And before we talk about Homicide, we have to talk about the mastermind behind this trilogy of connected series, David Simon. And considering the current Writers Guild of America strike, Simon's suspension by HBO, and his subsequent comments, it seems like there's no time like the present. So let's talk about Homicide, The Corner, and David Simon. David Simon's foray into journalism began long before The Wire, The Corner, and Homicide. Not only was Simon a writer for his high school newspaper, but he was a writer and later editor for the Diamondback while attending the University of Maryland College Park. He wrote a groundbreaking story on a former college basketball coach, Lefty Drysdale. After one of his players was accused of sexual misconduct, Drysdale called the woman and threatened her. Here's Simon's explanation of what took place.
In this era of Me Too and Time's Up, Lefty Drysdale would have immediately been sacked for throwing a tantrum after a campus judicial board disciplined one of his players for sexual impropriety, for also calling the victim repeatedly and screaming at her over the phone that if she didn't withdraw the complaint, her reputation would be destroyed on campus, and for doing so with a university administrator listening in on a phone extension in the undergraduate's dorm room. A scenario even half as ugly would have destroyed any practicing son of a bitch today. But no, back in 1983, boys would be boys, and after a long, quiet investigation and then a public wrist slap, the University of Maryland gave Drysdale a 5-year contract extension and more money.
Despite the school administration's knowledge of Drysdale's conduct, he was not fired, though I did find this archived article that talks about his reprimanding. Drysdale's Wikipedia page doesn't even mention his misconduct. In fact, he retired peacefully in 2003 and was inducted into the College Basketball Hall of Fame in 2007 and the Basketball Hall of Fame in 2018. The handling of the Drysdale incident helped determine Simon's attitude toward his work at The Sun from 1982 to 1995.
From that moment forward, I knew my ethos. The world would be the world, corruptions may abide, deceits may prevail, reform may descend to farce. All that may be true, but in the end, I still get to come to the campfire and tell you a story. And if the story is true, if I know most of what I need to know, and if I write it well enough, then okay. The rest of you motherfuckers can never say you didn't know. I'll take that much and run with it.
This dedication to unfiltered truth would bode well for Simon and led to a very prosperous writing career. While working at the Baltimore Sun, Simon was primarily a crime reporter, covering police-centered stories, and for the most part, he loved the job. Until 1986, when the Sun was purchased by the Times-Mirror Company, which also owned the Los Angeles Times, Newsday, the Denver Post, and many other newspapers. The buyout resulted in benefit cuts and a subsequent writing strike. After participating in the strike as a union captain, Simon was looking for a reason to spend some time away from the Sun. Though he wouldn't officially leave the Sun until 1995, this selling of the Sun would influence his decisions. Simon said,
"I got out of journalism because some sons of bitches bought my newspaper and it stopped being fun."
Simon would also say that Times-Mirror discovered that they could make more money with a mediocre paper than they could with a good one. Simon took a leave of absence from the Sun in 1988 to file the Baltimore Police Department's homicide unit. He took direction from something said to him by a Baltimore detective named Bill Lindsay in 1985.
I remember back in 85. It was Christmas Eve and about 4 in the morning. I brought a bottle up with me to the homicide unit for a little Christmas cheer. There was this good guy, Bill Lindsay, and he said, "If somebody wrote a book about what goes on during our year in this place, I would read it."
Due to his time as a crime reporter, Simon already had some semblance of a relationship with BPD, and after some hounding, they agreed to let him follow their homicide detectives for a year. Though it was Simon's goal to blend in while following the detectives, he got really close with them while working on the book. He said,
"I shared with the detectives a year's worth of fast food runs, bar arguments, and station house humor. Even for a trained observer, it was hard to remain aloof."
Now, I know I make these videos, but I am not a journalist, so knowing how involved Simon was with his subjects was surprising. Not wrong, just interesting. Nevertheless, forming bonds with his subjects will become a recurring theme for Simon throughout his career, keeping him connected with many of his subjects throughout the years for one reason or another, and led to lots of crossover in properties that he was affiliated with, and also put him in some interesting situations while studying his subjects. In the case of the homicide book, Simon's proximity to the detectives led to him helping to apprehend and search a suspect, and led to the involvement of some of the detectives in both Homicide and The Wire. Using his personal ethos and desire for truth to guide him, Simon decided that the goal of this book would be to show that police work is work, and not necessarily selfless and noble like many were made to believe at the time. Specifically, he wanted to give an accurate portrayal of detectives. Rather than seeking to do the most good, the detectives of the BPD treated their jobs like you or I would treat our jobs. Simon wasn't seeking to discuss whether this was right or wrong, just that it was. The book opens with the accidental murder of Roy Johnson, a nondescript drug dealer. Sergeant J. Landsman makes several jokes when they get to the crime scene and even tamper with his body prior to photos being taken. Johnson was killed on Gold and Edding by one of his workers, who was supposed to protect him and who would plead guilty to murder later. Simon makes it clear that this murder is just one of many for the officers and detectives in question. He also makes sure that the reader knows that the work isn't at all glamorous or altruistic.
The story of Roy Johnson's murder is brutal in its simplicity, simple in its brutality, scattered in front of Tom Pellegrini. 15 minutes either way and Pellegrini could have been dispatched to the Gatehouse Drive shooting, where a living victim and a living witness were waiting to give up a murder, and add one more to the list of clearances. Instead, Pellegrini went to Gold and Edding, where a 26-year-old dead man stared up at him with sudden, silent comprehension. Luck of the draw.
Simon stressed that clearing cases was the homicide unit's main concern. There's a saying they use in reference to clearing cases. First they're red, then they're green, then they're black. When the cases come in, they're written on the board in red. While working to solve the cases, the detectives would often go into overtime, so green, and when the case was solved, it was rewritten on the board in black. After the cases were cleared, they didn't matter anymore.
Consider the fact that a case is regarded to be cleared whether it arrives at the grand jury or not, as long as someone is locked up, whether for a week, for a month, or a lifetime. That murder is down. If the charges are dropped at the arraignment for lack of evidence, if the grand jury refuses to indict, if the prosecutor decides to dismiss the case or place it on the inactive or STEP docket, the murder is nonetheless carried to the books as a solved crime.
Remember this when we talk about The Wire. Simon also made sure to stress that the desk work was often just as important as solving the crime itself.
Murders come and go in this town, but God forbid you should forget to write the correct mileage on your activity sheet. Or worse yet, forget to note the parking space so that the next man spends 15 minutes walking up and down the headquarters garage.
In his dedication to realism, Simon adopts the lexicon of his subjects. For example, red ball murders are considered murders that matter, meaning that they draw a lot of media coverage and political attention. The BPD would always assign more resources to these cases. Another term used is citizen or taxpayer, which refers to those that are not touts, dealers, addicts, or otherwise involved in crime. Remember this lexicon thing when we talk about The Corner, but specifically when we discuss The Wire. Homicide, A Year of Killing on the Streets was published in June of 1991, and the Houghton Mifflin Harcourt publishers saw big potential in Simon's book and wanted to push it as a television series. Based on my experience in publishing, your agent will have a television and/or film rights department that will help pitch your books to studios for you, but this is successful for less than 1% of books. So the fact that Simon was able to do this successfully twice is huge. The show was picked up by NBC in 1993 and featured several characters based on the detectives that Simon followed. For example, Detective Frank Pembleton, portrayed by Andre Braugher, one of the series' most beloved characters, was based on Detective Harry Edgerton, who Simon shadowed during that year in Baltimore. Some detectives would play roles on the show, and others would play roles on The Wire and have fictionalized versions of themselves on The Wire as well. Homicide was also the home of Edward Munch, portrayed by Richard Belzer, who would also be a part of Law & Order in the years to come. In fact, Law & Order and Homicide would have several crossover episodes. Other important characters included Lieutenant Al Jardello, portrayed by the late great Yaphet Kotto, Kay Howard, the only female detective in the homicide unit at the start of the show, Mildred Lewis, Tim Bayliss, Steve Crosetti, Bo Felton, and many others. We'll talk a little more about Howard later. Even though Simon wouldn't be directly involved with the production of the show until season 3, the show operated in a fashion similar to the book. The detectives were focused on solving but mostly clearing cases. When he did get to work with production, Simon would say,
"That's like the greatest lie, I think, in dramatic TV is the cop who stands over a body and pulls up the sheet and mutters, damn, and looks down sadly. I mean, to a real homicide detective, it's just a day's work."
Considering how long the show ran, and the amount of things we have to cover in this video, I only want to focus on a few things that I found interesting because I just can't cover everything. First, the show was one of the first police procedurals to cover more than one case per episode. In fact, some cases are pursued throughout the duration of one or multiple seasons, with some of those longer cases never getting solved. Throughout the years, this has become a more common writing technique in terms of police procedurals and other crime-solving shows, but this was monumental at the time. Homicide premiered around the same time as NYPD Blue, and writers and producers needed to do something to set the two shows apart, and then of course to set Homicide apart from other police procedurals. Tom Fontana, Homicide's executive producer, said,
"I wanted to do a cop show without car chases and without gun battles. I wanted to do Homicide as a thinking man's unit. And so the minute Leviston said that, I said that's impossible. I have to be a part of this."
At times, the Homicide writing and production team was pressured into exploring love, closing cases, etc. by station executives, but they pushed back against this as much as they could in favor of taking more risks in terms of their storylines and character interactions. Doing things this way kept their writing from being too formulaic. They also often based their cases on real cases that they'd either learned about from Simon's book or from actual detectives.
Executive producer Tom Fontana asks James Yoshimura to pitch the group an idea based on a documentary Yoshimura saw on cable television.
HBO's got this taxi cab special thing, where they throw the camera up and thing. And I was watching it one night, and this middle-aged guy got into the cab, and the cab driver says, "What do you do?" "I'm a cop with, special unit of NYPD." And the guy would say, "Oh yeah, what do you do?" So I would respond to like hostage situations and bank robberies. And
Sure you could tell some stories.
I forget it. The cab driver says, "Come on, Tom, what's the worst thing you ever saw?"
I mean, I've seen every conceivable way a person could die. I've seen.
Really?
Numerous times.
What was the most, upsetting thing you ever saw?
When a guy gets hit by a train, not run over by a train, when he gets stuck in between the platform and the train.
They get pushed and they get stuck between the platform and the train. And generally they get stuck from the waist up.
It spins you around like this, okay? And you're stuck like this.
All twisted up.
You're all twisted up.
Oh, God.
Now what happens is, when I push that train off your body, the bottom part of your leg spins back this way, and all your guts fall down, and you die in less than a minute, you're dead.
Many cases are actually put into the show almost verbatim to how Simon wrote them in the book. I'll show you an example in a little bit. Due to how quickly and spontaneous the shows were written and filmed, the actors didn't get very much, if any, rehearsal time. This show was also well regarded because of its use of jump cuts to up a scene's intensity, to move through time quickly, or to replay a specific moment. Other than that, the show focused more on realism and even used music very sparingly so that it didn't undercut that realism. If you want more information about the way filming and editing work for this show, check out Anatomy of a Homicide, a behind-the-scenes documentary on the episode The Accident. though they call it the subway during production. Here are the two characters from Homicide that I thought were the most interesting, Howard and Pembleton. Kay Howard was the only female detective and the only one not based on one of Simon's real-life associates, based on what I read. According to production, they had to make up the rules for Howard because they didn't know how a female detective would conduct herself in an all-male unit. Tom Fontana, the show's executive producer, even had to fight to keep Howard on the show as executives didn't find her interesting, but she was still written out of the show starting with the 5th season, though she would appear in the Homicide film. Remember Kay Howard when we talk about Shakima Greggs on The Wire. They have some interesting similarities aside from the obvious. Frank Pembleton was one of my favorites to observe in the episodes that I got a chance to watch. I think he's written really well, and there are some interesting aspects to his character. He plays hockey, he's a practicing Catholic, though he has some issues with his religion throughout the show, and he makes it clear that he cares about solving all homicide cases and not just those of redeemable victims. As aforementioned, Pembleton was portrayed by Andre Braugher, who at the time was considered the best actor on television for his performance on the Homicide show. Pembleton is also the foil of Tim Bayliss. Bayliss is a rookie cop in Homicide's first season, and right along with Bayliss, the audience learns just how quickly murder comes and goes in the Homicide unit. Remember the parallel nature and juxtaposition of foils when we talk about The Wire, specifically when we discuss Marlo and Omar. Throughout the show's run, Giancarlo Esposito, a young Sean Nelson, Chris Rock, Alfre Woodard, James Earl Jones, Vincent D'Onofrio, Michael Michelle, Joe Morton, and Wallace Shawn would play roles on the show. For most of its run, Homicide was considered the best show that no one was watching. Though it would run for 7 seasons, its ratings were never really good. Right after its first season, the producers were worried it would be canceled since television studios wanted a show that would be an instant success, not something that audiences had to warm up to. Rather than canceling the show, NBC ordered an abnormally short second season. Though season 2 was only 4 episodes, it proved to be one of the show's most successful, bringing in nearly 25 million viewers for the season finale, Bop Gun. To put this in perspective, in Living Color, check out my series on Living Color if you haven't seen it, a show that ran from 1990 to 1994, regularly brought in around 20 million viewers per episode during its first 4 seasons. Act. Here are a couple of important cases that are covered throughout the show's run. In the very first season, we get the case of Adina Watson, an 11-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted and murdered. The case was important for Detective Tim Bayliss and would be investigated in the show over several episodes and is even brought up in later seasons. It's based on the real case of LaTanya Wallace, an 11-year-old whose rape and murder was never solved by Baltimore homicide detectives and is still discussed to this day. She's referred to as the Angel of Reservoir Hill, and while BPD investigated the murder, they have the full support of the people of Baltimore. This Red Ball case was covered in Simon's book. In season 3, Frank Pembleton has to interrogate a woman named Annabella Wilgus, aka the White Glove Killer. She has dissociative identity disorder, called multiple personality disorder at the time, and during her interrogation for a string of murders, she switches to her alters several times. When she begins mimicking everything Pembleton does, he burns himself, and she burns herself as well. Due to this, he's accused of abuse of power, and Wilgus sues the state. They settle out of court for $200,000 and a blow to Pembleton's reputation. Throughout, he also said, "I have enough to charge, or I don't have enough to charge," or "he's an asshole, or he's not an asshole." That struck me as the difference in the show, between the show and the book, is that the show really was like trying to tackle some great moral question through the use of character, and real life often isn't like that. Simon has a very detailed writing style, likely from his time as a journalist. He introduces a lot of characters and provides as much detail as possible, so sometimes the characters had to speak aloud to fill in the blanks, or the audience would lose much needed context, which explains the philosophizing. We also have to keep in mind the goal of police procedurals themselves. According to Vest, the police procedural represents police power as necessary to preserving social order, claims sympathy for impoverished citizens who live in crime-infested areas, but rarely deals with the institutional, structural, and social reasons that poverty and crime exist, and sees criminals as social deviants who fail to follow civilized rules, not as complex human beings trapped in an unjust system. The goal of police procedurals in general doesn't seem to really align with Simon's goals as a writer and creator, which explains why his next project deviated so drastically from everything that he'd done prior. For his next project, Simon would seek out the help of retired police officer Ed Burns. Simon's editor gave him the idea of observing a single corner in Baltimore, and Simon was able to convince Burns to put off becoming a middle school teacher to work on the book for a year. Simon and Burns chose the corner of Monroe and Fayette in the Franklin Square neighborhood, one of Baltimore's open-air drug markets. Though the corner was pretty much chosen at random, it was also chosen because there was a rather diverse group of addicts that solicited that particular corner. Simon said, "We actually chose the community we did because we wanted the audience to see the white drift from Pigtown and Morrell Park. People from external communities come there to buy, sometimes to fire up, but the drift told you that demand was multicultural." All events described as present day in the book took place in 1993, but Burns and Simon followed the subjects for a total of about 4 years in order to learn their patterns and in some cases to allow the subjects time to expose their own lies. Prior to even beginning to follow their subjects, Burns and Simon had to gain their trust. Burns and Simon spent a lot of time in Franklin Square in an attempt to get people comfortable with their presence. But of course, two middle-aged white guys leaning against a wall and hanging out in the corner looks a little sus. They had to convince the people on the corner that they weren't cops, and they had to convince the cops that they weren't up to anything sneaky. Sometimes, gaining trust also meant overstepping the professional boundaries that press reporters traditionally respect. Burns and Simon say, "We came to this project as reporters, but over time we found ourselves caring more about our subjects than we ever expected. The corner culture and addiction are powerful forces equal to or greater than all the legal barriers and social programming arrayed against them. On Fayette Street, the odds do not change because someone pops up with a notepad and the occasional kindness." Burns and Simon would often interact with their subjects in a variety of ways. For example, sometimes the book will mention the characters taking a hack to a different part of Baltimore or to an appointment, and more often than not, the hack was just Simon or Burns offering to take them where they needed to go. But for the most part, they stayed in the background, even in cases where they felt like they should have intervened. For example, Gary, part of the nuclear family at the center of the story, was jumped once by a few touts, while Simon was present and stood by. They maintained that they personally witnessed 75 to 80% of what was written in the book. Burns and Simon would describe their time following the people on the corner as follows.
"Our methodology was simple enough and is best described as stand around and watch journalism. We went to the neighborhood each day with notepads and followed people around. The dialogue in the book was either witnessed by one or both of us, or in a handful of instances reconstructed from detailed interviews with those involved. When it is indicated that characters are thinking about something, more often than not, we were present at the events upon which the person is reflecting, and their thoughts were verbally expressed to us at the time of the incident or immediately after the fact. In other cases, interior monologues were constructed from repeated interviews."
While Simon mentions that they had notepads and not recorders, they tried not to pull them out when following the subjects and would attempt to remember what happened until they got back to where they stored their notepad. In addition to observing a corner, Burns and Simon wanted to look at a specific nuclear family, so they focused on Gary McCullough, his ex-wife Denise Fran Boyd, and their son DeAndre McCullough, and their network. Not only were our three main subjects involved in the drug markets, with Frank and Gary being addicts and DeAndre selling, many of their family members and friends were involved in some way as well. After his book was released, Simon approached HBO about a television series. His colleague from Homicide, Tom Fontana, got Simon a meeting with Ann Thomopoulos, an HBO producer. Considering the reviews and subject matter of the book, HBO would only greenlight a mini-series of 6 episodes that focused on the main characters. They also required that Simon get a black writer to assist him with converting the book into a 6-episode teleplay. Simon enlisted the help of his friend David Mills. He also got Baltimore native Charles Rock Dutton to sign on as director. Dutton discovered acting while serving nearly 10 years in prison and received his master's in acting from the Yale School of Drama 7 years after he was released on parole. Simon and Burns made sure that they'd have final say on all of the scripts and that they'd be hands-on in terms of production before the show was greenlit. After reading the book and watching the series, they are very close. Charles D. Sutton, Simon, and everyone else involved really brought it to life really well. I'll discuss 4 characters in depth: Gary, DeAndre, Fran, and Miss Ella. I'll bring in source material where I feel it's most relevant, but first, let's talk about the show's most important character, the corner itself. Simon does a great job in both this series and The Wire of making characters out of the setting. Throughout the interactions that take place on the corner, we learn the language, rules, rituals, and common occurrences of this area. One of the most telling scenes is this one, when a man comes through with a horse and the horse pees on the pack. Not only do they beat the man up, but they beat his horse up too. There are a handful of deaths that take place during the story, but none of them seem to hold any real weight, which is just the nature of the corner. For example, when an addict named Hungry dies, Simon writes,
Hungry is not mourned as a lost soul so much as he is missed for continuity's sake. At the least, death interferes with the illusion. It always ruins the high.
Something similar happens with a man named Brett. He shares his dope with his friends and dies very soon after. Those same friends move on without a hitch.
That was Brett who fell out?
Yeah.
What was he from?
Spider Bass Blue Top.
Man, I gotta get this. Not Brett on his ass. That shit got to be right.
We learned that every morning touts put out testers. Every day, addicts figure out their caper for the day so that they can get their blast. We learn what it means to get burned, how common it is for police officers to perform jump outs and dicky checks. We learn that in the world of the corner, a child around 10 or 11 years old can become a tout and smoke next to 15 and 16-year-olds, sometimes adults, and it's treated like business as usual. From the map that Burns and Simon provide, you can see just how interconnected everything is in this neighborhood. The Dewdrop Inn, a shooting gallery where Fran, DeAndre, and DeAndre's younger brother Derod stay, is right up the street from Blue's shooting gallery and right near Gary's childhood home and the house he bought for he, DeAndre, and Fran once upon a time. They are also really close to the rec center, the place that's meant to be a safe haven for the children in this area. All of these things coexist in the same neighborhood. Simon and Burns tell us that there are two rules to the corner. First, get the blast. That's the motivation of many addicts. Second, never say never, because the addicts never know what they will do to get a blast that day. The third implied rule of the corner is that it doesn't matter where you go, the corner is everywhere. At the top of the story, Gary McCullough, portrayed by T.K. Carter, has been addicted for 4 years. He dropped out of college when Fran got pregnant with DeAndre and decided to spend all of his time working and investing in stocks and learning about real estate. Gary worked 2 or 3 jobs at a time and made sure that Fran and DeAndre didn't want for anything. Fran wasn't really interested in being with Gary, nor did she want to settle down. Though Fran began using prior to the end of their marriage, Gary wouldn't start using until after it ended, and Gary never discussed what exactly pushed him toward drug use in the first place in the show, nor in the book, if I remember correctly. It seems that some blame his addiction on Fran, but it doesn't look like Gary does.
Ladies.
Yeah, well, you know, I done messed with these drugs for the longest time.
And everyone in the neighborhood says things were going very well for you. You worked 2 full-time jobs.
Yeah, plus a home development company I started on the side, yeah.
You drove a Mercedes-Benz.
Well, things was going good.
So why'd you start shooting heroin?
Want to give me a cigarette? I need a cigarette.
Gary's brother Wee-bey is also an addict. In the very first episode, we get an interview with Gary, and right after, he gets scammed by his girlfriend Ronnie. His arrangement with Ronnie is an atypical relationship. It essentially means that they depend on each other for dope. They actually don't really like each other and are not attracted to one another either, but it's an arrangement that works for them in most cases. Gary and Ronnie's cousin Tony go on a caper that involves stealing copper pipes and taking them to United Iron and Metal Works. This was a common caper for people in the neighborhood since there were never any questions about where the metal comes from. We'll see this again with Bubbles and Johnny in The Wire. Right from the first episode, Gary talks about his diverse interests and shows the sheer amount of knowledge that he has on a variety of topics.
You went to college, didn't you?
Yeah. Ohio State. 1 year, and I came back when Fran had Andre.
People say you played the stock market. You taught yourself how to invest the money that you were earning.
Yeah, I had this account at Charles Schwab up to about like $150,000. Yeah, man, it got so that I could pick the stocks just by looking at the price-earnings ratio. You know what that is?
I'm not much on stocks.
Let me tell you something. Science to it.
In fact, many people on the corner know just how successful Gary used to be and encourage him to get clean on several occasions. In the first episode, Gary's mother sends him to the store for 5 pounds of potatoes and 2 boxes of hamburger helper. You can see that he struggles with whether or not to steal the money or to get the groceries, but he decides to do the right thing. He buys his mom's groceries and goes back home. However, the book actually stresses just how difficult of a decision this was for Gary in a way that the show never could.
He stands there for a moment, staring at the bill, watching it burn his palm. The price of admission. He hesitates, his mind taking in the runoff from some rare reservoir of better nature. Something is going on here. something that suddenly seems more important than all the promises he gave no real thought to keeping. He thinks about cutting the order, maybe shave off a nickel. Tell her he got mixed up or just drop the bag in the kitchen while she's upstairs sleeping. It would be nothing to keep 5 and find a hookup with some other short money. He's trapped in the aisle, holding 1 box of hamburger helper, then 2, then 1 again. He looks at the label. The stuff ain't even good for you. Too many chemicals. He stands there for a minute more, until the scales tip and he grabs both boxes and the taters, goes to the register and gives up a bill as crumpled as his spirit.
In episode 4, Gary goes to see Schindler's List and goes back to the shooting gallery to tell the others about the film and his thoughts on quitting.
The one about what they did to the Jews in the war.
You went to see a movie?
Lord, what they did to them people.
What kind of dope fiend go to the goddamn movie?
Germans decided that they weren't human no more. They just said, no, you ain't human like we human. And when they said that, hey man, it just got easy for them to do all kinds of dirt. By the end, all the Germans could do, man, was like get rid of them, you know, kill them all. Because, you know, they couldn't see them being anything better than rats or bugs.
That sounds like a miserable ass movie.
Yeah, but it was real, all right? And I'm sitting there, and I'm watching this movie, and I'm realizing that it's happening again.
How you mean, Gary?
Hey, man, we sitting here day after day making ourselves a little bit less human, and the world's happy to see it. It seems like they're happy to see it, man. I mean, when I was making money, like, it didn't matter, because I was still a nigga. And now that I'm sitting up here getting high with y'all, it's still the same.
You talk some crazy shit, Gary.
Don't you see what I'm saying? The Germans made the Jews and the niggas. That's what that was about. And that's what this is here. Except we doing it to ourselves. Seems like the world just can't wait for us to finish.
Scalio, another of the people there, who was played by Reg E. Cappy, says,
just shut up and shoot dope.
Once, during an interview, our director even hurries Gary to the end of his point because he feels like he's talking too much.
He took me down to Carolina and down to my brother Dan's house down there in Fayetteville. And they figured that if they could just, like, get me out of Baltimore, that...
So what happened?
Gary is a pushover, and people just walk over him, including the interviewer and director. Later in the episode, Dutton interviews Gary's father, William. When asked what they should do to get drugs off of the street, William says,
I'd get rid of all of this. Stop it cold.
How would you do that?
All these people selling these drugs, I get them down at the penitentiary, all of them. And I run that gas chamber till all this here stops.
He doesn't even take into account that 2 of his sons would cease to exist if this plan was put into action.
Also, what Gary's father says here about the gas chamber is a direct reflection or reference back to what Gary was talking about when he told the addicts about Schindler's List.
Gary operates with the code in mind, like Omar, and doesn't want to do anything violent and is adverse to crime in general. Knowing this about him, people are constantly playing him. From Fran to Ronnie to his friend Will, who takes Gary's idea of making cars disappear by selling them to United Iron and Metal Works, which allowed the owner of the car to cash in on an insurance claim, aka commit insurance fraud. Though Gary took a stance on violence, he was violent on 2 occasions in the narrative, both related to drug use. Once, prior to using, he smacked Fran because she refused to stop using. Another time, he pushed Ronnie. This is something that Ronnie made him pay for by pressing charges that she later dropped, and making sure that her mother started drama with Gary's mother at the hearing. Though Ronnie admits that she embellished the story about Gary hitting her, the prosecutor says that the charges will remain no matter what. If Ronnie insists that she gave false testimony, Ronnie will be charged. This shows the audience that this is just about numbers for some in the prosecutor's office, just like it is for police officers and detectives. Eventually, the prosecutor asks Gary,
why would Miss Boyce go to the trouble to report to the police that you assaulted her if you didn't?
You know, she got mad. You know, we had a fight.
About what? What were you arguing about?
Money.
How much money?
A few dollars. I don't remember.
You're saying that Miss Boyce made up a story about you hitting her because of a few dollars?
She's completely naive to the lives that Gary, Ronnie, and their associates live. Gary gets a job at a crab house even though he has a seafood allergy and makes it a point to take pride in his work in the hopes of getting hired on full time. Unfortunately, this doesn't work, and when summer comes to an end, he's laid off. Though his firing is understandable since crab season is over, this work hard, get rewarded myth is something that Simon touches on several times throughout his entire career. Once he said, if you're not smarter than the next guy, if you're not slick or clever, but if you're willing to get up every day and work your ass off and come home and be a citizen and be committed to your family and your job and whoever you work for, there will be a place for you and you won't be betrayed. And I think that has been proven to be a lie. The newspaper that I left just presented the employees who work there with a contract that eliminates 401k contributions toward their pension and asks them for 45% of their medical costs. That notion of if you do what you're supposed to do and you keep your end of the social contract, you won't be betrayed by the institutions that you're working for, that's been proven a lie time and time again. And that's kind of what we want you to feel at the end of this. Eventually, Gary gets some detox meds from a store and he gets clonidine from a doctor. It seems like he really wants to take quitting seriously, but it's understandably difficult. Though he tells the others that clonidine is helping him do less dope, he's lying. This is another place I feel like the show really couldn't illustrate how hard things were for Gary. So here's a bit from the book about Gary and his snake.
It's Gary's worst fear. The snake down there sliding through his intestines, growing, gathering strength, pushing its way through the soft organs of his underbelly. For many of the fiends, it isn't even like that. For them, withdrawal is a few days of low-grade flu, a sickness to be dealt with like any other. But for Gary, there's no play in it. The thing is all physical. For him, the very idea of withdrawal is epic because the snake owns every cell, every vein, every organ.
In episode 5, Fran urges Gary to make a change and get clean. The real Gary McCullough made several earnest efforts at getting clean. In fact, once after getting burned, he told the kid that sold him the dope that it was garbage, and he got jumped, resulting in loss of vision in one eye, and he began trying to get clean again. At almost a month clean, he returned to the corner and later overdosed in his parents' basement. His brother Junpei was using with him at the time and spent time cleaning the basement and dragging Gary out of the house before calling 911. Gary was deceased upon arrival at the hospital. Burns and Simon wrote that after Gary died, they didn't write a word for months. Fran Boyd, played by Candy Alexander, is an addict. We meet Fran in episode 2. DeAndre is locked up and she immediately goes and gets him out. Fran feels conflicted because she wants DeAndre to stop selling and continue in school, but she's also an addict on a fixed income. She, DeAndre, and Derod are living in a shooting gallery, the Dewdrop Inn, with her sister Bunchy and her brother Steve and Steve's son. She goes from telling DeAndre to stop selling to telling him to sell, but to give her half.
This shit is not for you.
Yeah, I
think you're a man, huh? But you're not. You still my child, and this is not for children.
Please, come on.
Okay, you see what this shit did to your daddy, right? You see where I'm at with it. This ain't no fucking joke. You still got the rest of the package?
Yeah, we had just re-up. Now I gotta get rid of all that just to pay Bugsy back.
That shit dead, Dre.
What you mean?
I mean, that shit dead. When you got locked up, the police took your whole stash.
Nah, they just took 16.
DeAndre, now you gonna put it with the police, okay? You tell Bugsy the police got your whole pack. Then you rebuy that shit as something else and you sell it somewhere else. Now you see? See? You're still thinking like a little boy.
But you just told me you're gonna put me out if I keep slinging. Now you're telling me what you want me to do is put the rest of Bugsy stuff out there?
Just give it to me, okay? I'll take half, and I'll give you the rest.
Fran gets on the wait list at Baltimore Rehab Center and nearly gets caught stealing from the mall when trying to get some toys for Derod. DeAndre comes through toward the end of the episode and buys all of the toys for Derod, and we'll talk about their relationship in a little bit. In episode 3, we get an interview with Fran at the start. She talks about how she absolutely does her best by DeAndre and Derod even though she's an addict. She makes sure that they have a home of some sort. She does her best to keep them in school and to keep them fed. It's clear that there is effort being exerted on Fran's part. She's absolutely hypocritical at times, but she often has the best intentions, and I think that really comes through. In fact, when Fran starts calling weekly to get a bed at the Baltimore Rehab Center, which I'll be calling the BRC, she tells DeAndre about it so that he knows that she's making difficult choices and putting the effort in to change her life, so that he will do the same.
What? I've been calling over the BRC. Now, every week I've been making that call just to be sure that I stay on the list, and pretty soon my bed gonna be coming up.
That's good to hear.
That's letting you know that I'm trying to. All right, then?
Prior to getting a bed at BRC, Fran misunderstands some instructions they give her and thinks that her bed has come up when it hasn't, and she still has to wait a week. She has this big last hurrah and makes a big show of saying goodbye to everyone, only to be sent right back to the Dewdrop Inn.
Can I help you?
It's Fran. Boy.
Oh, right, Fran, hi.
I check in today.
Who told you that?
When I called last week, they said 1 more week.
You're at the top of the list, Fran, but we aren't expecting anybody today.
They said when...
Fran, if they told you that, it was a mistake.
Mistake? You goddamn right it was a mistake. Now, they told me to come in last week. They told me to come in here, okay? They told me to come here.
I'm just saying, Fran, that it's a misunderstanding. Now, I know we have a bed coming open next week.
Wait a minute. How am I supposed to wait? Believe this shit. I done told everybody I was gone.
I'm sorry, Fran.
What am I supposed to tell people, huh?
You're at the top of the list. There'll definitely be a bed next week.
This is an incredibly crushing moment, not only because another week might be the difference between life and death for Fran, but also because no one is surprised that she's back. DeAndre is the only one that even reacts to her return, which lets us know that Gary's several feeble attempts at getting clean are all too common for the other addicts as well. Eventually, Fran gets a bed at the BRC, and when she gets out, she tells Bunchy that she can't stay at the Dewdrop Inn anymore because she can't be around drugs anymore. After getting her own place with her boys, Fran begins to feel a sort of emptiness. She begins to wonder what her purpose is. She's enrolled in community college courses, but begins falling behind because she doesn't understand the work, and DeAndre and Derod have their own interests and motivations outside of her. She can't go be with her siblings as they're addicted except for her brother Scoogie, and she can't go see her old friends. She feels alone. Save for her children, everyone she cares about or with whom she shares a story is a drug addict. Every one of them, friends, family, acquaintances, stands now as a threat to the fragile idea of recovery. When she left the detox center, it was with a feeling of power, and the 8 weeks since then, it has come to seem little more than an illusion. This causes her to befriend a recovering addict named Marvin, played by Lance Reddick. Marvin starts causing trouble with Derod and DeAndre and starts using in the house. But Fran holds on to him for a while before eventually letting him go. Fran begins to feel like it's not fair that she's struggling so much with getting clean and with getting out of their neighborhood. Why not Marvin? Why not her for that matter? How is it that some people start to stumble and then catch themselves? How does anyone find it possible to tear themselves to shreds time and time again, and then, against any sensible expectation, find strength enough to piece himself back together? In episode 6, Fran is officially using again. In the book, this is more of a slow burn, and Fran intentionally goes to a different corner so that her friends don't find out before going back to Fat Kurt. But in both, Kurt refuses to sell to her and urges her to keep doing the right thing even though it's hard.
Where the pink tops at? That young boy that had him earlier, where he at?
He's gone.
Where?
It's 4 o'clock in the morning. He's gone.
What you got?
Spider bag and black tops.
Let me get 1-on-1.
You were doing so good.
Don't talk shit, Kurt. 1-on-1. Come on with it.
Go on home.
Goddamn, but you gonna stay in there and act like you forgot how to sell drugs?
Man. Go home.
Later, Fran goes to an NA meeting to get some new motivation and encouragement to continue working on her sobriety. Later, Fran would go on to work at the Baltimore Recovery Center before being laid off because she didn't have the qualifications. Instead of letting this stop her, she decided to go back to school to gain those qualifications. Around 2007, she married Donnie Andrews. Remember Andrews when we talk about Omar and The Wire. Fran went on to pass in May of 2022 at the age of 65. DeAndre McCullough, played by Sean Nelson, is 15 years old and he sells drugs. In the first episode episode, we learn that DeAndre is his own man and marches to his own drum, but he absolutely craves a better relationship with his parents. We see this during this basketball scene with Gary. Gary puts the hoop up at the rec center for DeAndre and his friend RC, and then starts to play basketball with DeAndre, but before they really get into it, Ronnie comes along and Gary leaves without a second thought. It's a really sad scene. In episode 2, we learned that DeAndre started selling at 13. In his interview, DeAndre makes it clear that he wants to go back to school and do something with his life. He just looks at selling as a way to get quick money. Though he's missed too much school to be in the correct grade, he believes Rose Davis, the school administrator, will grant him social promotion. The fact that he even knows what this means that it's a common thing for him and his friends.
You ever been arrested?
Twice.
So you've seen jail?
No, I got recogs both times. But I still gotta go to juvenile court, though. But it's not like that's all I'm about, though, neither. I'm just trying to get some money right now, you know what I'm saying? I'm gonna go back to school this semester, get put back on the roads.
What grade are you in?
9th.
You're almost 16 and you're only in the 9th grade?
I got put out. But if I go back and be cool with it for a while, they give me a social promotion in 10th grade real quick.
What's a social promotion?
It's when they promote you for being cool with it.
We'll see it again in The Wire, in fact. The interviewer asks how DeAndre can sell drugs when they have impacted his family. He says,
"You know my father?"
Yeah, we talked. So how do you sell drugs knowing where they left him?
People who use, they gonna use. They gonna buy it from somebody somewheres. Might as well be me.
Fran kicks DeAndre out when she figures out he's selling, so he goes back to their old house. But once Gary and Ronnie steal from him a couple of times, he goes back to the Dewdrop Inn with Fran. Later, Fran also steals from him, so the move was all for naught. When DeAndre finally makes his way back to school, he fills in for a classmate by reading a speech at an assembly.
And when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of that old Negro spiritual.
Both he and his teacher see that he kind of has a natural talent for speaking, and he eventually competes in an oratory contest. It's kind of clear that he didn't know what the contest would be like and just phoned it in, but he enjoyed himself and even said he could win the contest if he wanted to. Brendan Simon Wright.
No, DeAndre will not win points from any judges today, but neither will he be embarrassed. For whatever reason, he raised his hand, and today he showed up, wore the suit, went through with it, so that, for at least this moment, he has stepped from the shadows of the corner.
When he stopped selling drugs during this episode, his other friends, the Crenshaw Mafia brothers, a name they got from Boys in the Hood, stopped selling as well. DeAndre is clearly the natural leader of this group. In the initial interview of episode 2, DeAndre gets upset with the interviewer for asking about Fran's using.
Does your mother use drugs? Look, I didn't mean anything by it.
This is just a hunch, but I feel like he did that because of how complicated their relationship is. He very clearly blames her for his father's drug addiction, but he's also more protective of her than he is of Gary.
Hey, you who was doing so good.
What don't you think about doing good sometimes, huh? Maybe if you detox, you could get back with my father and everything could be just like it was.
Okay, so you just done lost your mind. Because your dad is just as much a dope fiend as I am.
He'd still be on top right now if you hadn't drug him down.
All right, you know what? Gary McCullough is a grown man. And he made the choice to be out there doing what he doing.
You brought him down.
Also, it shows that DeAndre himself is fairly complex. He's just as nice and welcoming as Gary sometimes, and other times, he's just as conniving as Fran. DeAndre works at the Sea Pride Crab House for a little while, but leaves when his shellfish allergy starts to get the best of him. Eventually, Ella, the director of the rec center, tries to hook him up with a job at Checkers, but this falls through. Around episode 4, DeAndre's motivations change. He finds out that his on-again, off-again girlfriend Tyreka is pregnant. The book tells us that DeAndre has been sexually active since the age of 11 due to SA from an older cousin. When RC and DeAndre find out that they will be fathers, they're pretty excited about it, but that does eventually fall through. And though he's made this commitment to take care of Tyreka's unborn baby, in the latter parts of the book, it shows that DeAndre doesn't really follow through, at least not initially. DeAndre's motivations also change around this part because he sees that Fran is doing well in rehab and it makes him want to do better. Tyreeka comes and asks DeAndre for money for an abortion, even though abortions are free at a nearby hospital and she doesn't plan on getting one. So she's running game on him. But again, we learn through this scene that that's what the culture is like.
Some people use God as their higher power, as far as getting in the church, but I use my kids as my higher power, and I know if I'm not there for them, they're going to turn out like I did, so I just do my best to be the best person I can, and hopefully things will work out.
In episode 5, DeAndre leaves Miss Ella's rec league team because he refuses to pay the swear fines that the referees impose, but in the book, it's because Pumpkin, an addict, is their coach and makes them pay to attend practice so that he and his assistant coach can get a blast. Miss Ella then tells DeAndre that he is wrong for cursing out the referees and that he's afraid of effort, but Burns and Simon make sure to discuss just how difficult it was for DeAndre to get up and make good decisions every day.
But that's the way the outside world can afford to view it, as if the same free will that makes life worth living elsewhere can strut down to Mountain Fayette without getting his ass beat bloody. The fact is, it's never so much a decision as it is the absence of a decision. It would require Herculean strength for DeAndre to find a new moment, to pivot and walk away from the only world he's ever negotiated, a world that guarantees him some kind of standing. And now, with Tyreeka and his son and his own future at stake, that moment simply doesn't come.
DeAndre starts selling again and staying out all night, but after Fran threatens him with a call to his probation officer, he decides to behave better. In this episode, we also get a kind of humorous scene. Some DC guys lay claim to the corner where CMB usually posts and tell CMB that they have to go elsewhere. Instead, CMB posts on the corner again to lure out the DC guys, and what comes from that is the scene where all of the CMB guys are running from and shooting at one another because they don't know what they're doing, because they're just kids. After missing a couple of days of work due to a scheduling mix-up, DeAndre quits instead of waiting to be fired. We also see DeAndre try drugs for the first time. This is something that Simon didn't learn about until DeAndre was around 17 years old, though he did start using at the age of 15. Most of CMB is actually doing drugs by this point, and DeAndre is too far gone in this final scene to warn the others about the officers rolling into the row house. This quote from Vest is a great summation of the series. The audience begins to see Gary, Fran, DeAndre, Blue Ebbs, and Fat Kurt as they see themselves, downtrodden people enduring difficult circumstances who cannot, no matter how much they struggle, resist what appears to be an inevitable descent into oblivion. Even the characters who avoid addiction, such as Tyreeka and Ella, find themselves living in a culture pervaded by the rules, precepts, and codes that the drug trade creates, obeys, and sustains. After the events covered in the book and the series, DeAndre started using coke, heroin, and morphine. He yo-yoed with getting clean like Gary. His attempts always seemed earnest, but the longevity just wasn't there. DeAndre McCullough would have small roles in The Corner and The Wire, and he worked on Simon's show Tream prior to passing from a drug overdose in 2012 at the age of 35. His father, Gary, was also in his mid-30s when he passed. I really think the series did a disservice to Miss Ella Thompson, the director of the rec center. She is portrayed by Tyra Farrell. In the book, we see Ella for the first time while she's getting ready to attend the funeral of a young person who died on the corner. She makes it a point to attend as many of them as she can because her daughter was killed. It's also due to her daughter's death that she feels this dedication to Baltimore. Burns and Simon write, "She goes to the board meetings, listens carefully, and agrees with anything said on the community's behalf. And if anyone asks for her help, she grants it without regard to the fact that she has already volunteered for a half dozen other neighborhood initiatives. There is no priority or method to her across-the-board commitment. Just the idea that there is a critical mass, that if she joins and serves and works hard enough, Fayette Street will surely get better." Ella makes it a point not to judge anyone on the corner. She invites Blue to come and teach art at the rec center. She tries to help DeAndre find a job and makes it clear that CMB is always welcome at the rec center and that they're all teeming with potential. Here are her thoughts. If they're slinging, so be it. If they're getting high, that's their business. Even more than Ella, the boys of Fayette Street have no interest in making judgments about anything save for the basketball itself. Everyone slings. Everyone gets high. And at this point, if Fat Kurt himself came into the gym, shouted them into submission, then showed them how to win a basketball game, they'd probably run for Kurt. There's also a scene where she approaches Fat Kurt on the corner and asks if they can pause what they're doing when she walks her kids through the area. In the book, Ella gets the attention and obedience of everyone on the corner without anyone else's help. She was just sort of that important to this community at the time. Many of the people that Simon and Burns interviewed for the book would make cameos in the series, including DeAndre, Fran, Blue, Deontay, which is DeAndre and Tyreeka's son, Tyrika, and Ronnie. Some of them also went on to do very well for themselves, with Derad becoming a firefighter and Tyrika graduating from college. Prior to her death, Miss Ella went on to work with an organization called Kids Grow in a similar role. Fran and Blue went on to become drug counselors. The end of the corner is hopeful in a sense. Tyrika, Blue, DeAndre, and Fran get together with Charles S. Dutton, and they discuss their hopes for the series. And after learning their stories, it just feels good to see their faces as we wrap things up. Blue would pass around 2009 from complications with liver failure. Miss Ella would pass from a heart attack prior to the series being filmed.
This fund was actually set up in Miss Ella's honor after she passed, and the Wire production crew would actually be instrumental in raising funds for this project, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about The Wire.
Fat Kurt would pass from liver failure, and Rita, the doctor from Blue's shooting gallery, would also pass due to the infections from the gangrene in her arms. Many of the others that Burns and Simon followed would pass in the years following the book's publication, including DeAndre's cousin Dinky, who was killed at 17, and his good friend RC. As of 2023, I believe the only person who Burns and Simon followed that is still alive is Tyrika Freeman, though Derad and Deontay are also alive, and I believe they're doing well. The rec center is still open, but it seems to operate under a different name, the Ruth M. Kirk Recreational Center. The center got more funding from fire dispatcher Arthur Squeaky Kirk, and it looks like they're doing great things in Baltimore. This series is pretty well regarded, though some considered it difficult to watch. According to a critic named Jacob Weisberg, the series is nearly unwatchable because, however true to life, the extended depiction of shrieking crack whores and broken down junkies 10 cents short of the price of a Lucy is too much to take. But at the same time, its realism is why it's so monumental. The Corner, Weisberg implies, mirrors life so closely that the audience feels the same existential claustrophobia that its characters experience. The sense of being trapped in a nightmare that may never end looms over the entire venture, rendering The Corner a notable example of naturalistic television drama that acknowledges the harsh realities of urban America's social decline. Some reviewers thought the interviews at the end mess with the flow of the episodes and take away from the gravity of its final scenes, but I think they add in a lot of important context and show the audience what it may have been like for Burns and Simon to conduct these interviews in a seemingly volatile space. I wanted to jump in to say that I didn't mention that one of the biggest criticisms of both The Corner and The Wire is that they profit off of depicting minorities in bad situations. So, as addicts, dealers, thugs, corrupt politicians, etc. I haven't spoken to anyone from Baltimore about the show. I'm still working on that, but I think that this argument is missing a lot of nuance. But I also think that there is some truth to it. Though I don't want to go too deep into this until we actually talk about The Wire, I wanted to let you know that it's on my mind, so I haven't forgotten about it. Similarly, I didn't get into much about the history of Baltimore and the war on drugs in this video because that's also something I wanted to save for The Wire. In each of his books, Simon makes sure to give us a lot of context. He talks about how the McCulloughs, so the paternal side of Gary's family, got to Maryland from the South, for example, and puts a lot of that into context. But he also talks about larger issues like the history of unfair labor practices, the damage done by property development companies and gentrification, and a lot of other things that help create a clearer portrait of the why behind the corner culture. The Wire presents several perspectives on the war on drugs and on the city in general as well. We get the views of politicians, law enforcement, teachers, addicts, journalists, dealers, kingpins, children. It's a lot more layered and nuanced. So in addition to looking into some other sources to corroborate the information given by Simon, I want to make sure that I absorb everything I can from the show before I talk about it. So we'll talk more about statistics and factual information at some point while we're talking about The Wire. On the heels of Simon and Burns' success with The Corner, they returned to HBO with another gritty and realistic series that would change television history in addition to impacting the way we discuss addiction, the war on drugs, failing school systems, and the role of the media. Of course, that show was called The Wire. I wanted to jump in at the end just to say thank you to all of the new people that have subscribed. It's been kind of overwhelming, actually. A lot of you, you pretty much came over at once. But thank you for being here, and I hope that you don't unsubscribe. I have some really fun stuff planned. Some of you have already figured out some of my plans, actually. But my number one goal with this channel is just to do stuff that we both think is fun and interesting to talk about, while also clearing up some of the lore involved with a lot of television shows, music, and other sort of aspects of pop culture, Black pop culture specifically. I really hope you stick around, and thank you for stopping by at all. Bye.